Imagine being torn from your home, your family, your entire world, yet refusing to let anyone erase your name. This is the story of the one enslaved man America tried for generations to silence, but never could. Today, we uncover the real life of Kunta Kinte, not the polished Hollywood version, not the filtered textbook summary, but the true African story that survived against every attempt to bury it. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories history tried to forget. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to 1750 to the coast of the Gambia, where a boy named Kunta Kinte made a promise to himself. They may take my freedom, but they will never take my identity. In 1766, in the West African kingdom of Mandinka, there lived a boy whose name would become synonymous with resistance itself. A boy who would challenge the foundations of American power. A boy who would refuse to be erased. His name was Kunta Kinte. But this is not the story America taught in classrooms. This is not the sanitized version that appeared in network television. This is the account that has been fragmented, buried beneath centuries of deliberate forgetting. This is the narrative that those in power feared would spread, would inspire, would transform how we understand the very fabric of this nation. What you are about to hear represents a departure from comfortable history. The details contained within these hours ahead challenge the mythology that built America's wealth. They expose the mechanisms of an industry that operated not in darkness alone, but in the clear light of day, with the full knowledge and participation of the most powerful institutions on earth. Kunta Kinte was not simply a slave. He was a free man who was stolen. He was a prince of his people. He was a scholar. He was a warrior. He was someone's son. He was someone's future. And his story, the real story, reveals truths about the nature of exploitation that still echo through the centuries. This documentary spans 15 hours because his story demands that time. Because the complexity of his life cannot be compressed into comfortable segments. Because America's relationship to his bondage cannot be addressed in anything less than meticulous, unflinching detail. So we begin now, in the year 1750, in the region that Europeans would come to call the Slave Coast. The Mandinka people had existed in West Africa for centuries before the first Portuguese caravels appeared on the horizon. They were not a people waiting to be discovered. They were not primitive inhabitants living in chaos. They were an organized civilization with sophisticated systems of governance, commerce, education, and spiritual practice. The Mandinka Empire stretched across vast territories in what is now Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and the EAS surrounding regions. They were traders, they were scholars, they were farmers who understood agricultural practices that had been refined across generations. They were builders who constructed cities and fortifications. They were musicians and storytellers who kept history alive through oral tradition, a practice as rigorous and reliable as any written archive. In Jufure, the village where Kunta Kinte was born, life operated according to rhythms that had held steady for centuries. The village was organized into compounds, each compound housing an extended family. The eldest males held authority. The elders held wisdom. The young were educated in the ways of their people through observation, through apprenticeship, through ceremony. Kunta's father was Omoro Kinte, a respected warrior and a man of standing in the community. His mother was Binta Keba. The name Kunta itself carried meaning in the Mandinka language. It suggested one who is balanced, who is centered, who understands the natural order of things. From his earliest years, Kunta was prepared for a specific role in his society. He was being groomed to become a warrior, a protector of his people, a man who would defend the interests of the Mandinka nation. This was not an abstract responsibility. This was preparation for a life of active participation in the security and survival of his community. The education of a young Mandinka boy involved multiple stages, each one progressively introducing him to greater responsibilities and deeper knowledge. He learned the history of his people through recitation and repetition. He learned the teachings of Islam, which had become the dominant faith among the Mandinka, integrated with older spiritual practices that had existed before. He learned that the world contained natural law, patterns that governed the movement of seasons, the growth of crops, the relationships between people. He learned that honor was a currency more valuable than any other form of wealth. He learned that the word of a man was his bond, and that a man without his word was a man without substance. At the age of 15, Kunta was prepared to enter the men's council to begin his formal training as a warrior. This was the pivotal moment in a young man's life among the Mandinka. It marked the transition from childhood to manhood. It carried ceremonial significance. It involved ordeals and tests designed to prove the young man's readiness to bear the responsibilities of adulthood. Kunta had demonstrated the qualities necessary for this transition. He was strong, he was intelligent, he was respectful of tradition. He had shown the discipline required of a warrior. His family was proud. His community had expectations for him. His future seemed as clear and inevitable as the sun rising in the east. But in 1766, when Kunta Kinte was 16 years old, this future, the one that had been promised to him by blood, by ceremony, by the natural order of his world, was severed by violence. The Atlantic slave trade was not a spontaneous phenomenon. It was not the result of tribal conflicts that naturally led to the enslavement of captives. It was an industry, a deliberate, calculated, profit-driven enterprise that had been constructed over nearly 300 years by European merchants, European governments, and European merchants who had invested enormous sums in the infrastructure of human trafficking. By the time Kunta Kinte came of age, the slave trade was operating at an industrial scale. African merchants had become complicit in the system. Some African rulers had recognized the profitability of the trade and had begun to participate in the capture and sale of their neighbors, their enemies, and sometimes their own people. The mechanics of this system operated on the coast, in the fortified trading posts that European nations had established along the West African shoreline. The Portuguese had established the first of these posts in the early 1500s. By the 18th century, the British, French, Dutch, and other European powers had constructed a series of fortifications, castles really, that served as holding centers for enslaved people before they were transported across the Atlantic. But the capture of enslaved people did not originate at these coastal fortresses. The actual capture happened inland, in raids that were organized and financed by Europeans but often executed by African raiders who had been recruited into the system. These raids were not random. They were targeted. They aimed at acquiring strong, healthy young people who could survive the journey across the Atlantic and be profitable once they reached the Americas. In the case of Kunta Kinte, The circumstances of his capture remain somewhat unclear from the historical record, but what is known is this: he was taken from his village. Whether he was captured during a raid, sold by someone he trusted, or separated from his family through some other mechanism, the outcome was the same. He became merchandise in a system designed to transform human beings into commodities. The process of being converted from a free person into an enslaved person involved multiple stages, each one designed to strip away identity, to break resistance, to force compliance. First came the journey to the coast. For many captives, this journey alone killed them. It took weeks or months depending on the distance traveled. People were chained, underfed, subjected to brutal treatment. Those who became ill or who showed resistance were sometimes killed because dead weight reduced profit. When Kunta reached the coast, he was placed in a holding cell, a dungeon, essentially, in one of the European fortresses. These dungeons were dark. They were poorly ventilated. They were filthy. Multiple people were crammed into spaces that were designed for far fewer bodies. Disease flourished in these conditions. Dysentery, malaria, and other illnesses killed people constantly. It was in these dungeons that Kunta experienced his first true understanding of the catastrophe that had befallen him. He was no longer in Africa, in the world he knew. He was in a European fortress, surrounded by other captives whose languages he might not have understood, witnessing a system of control and domination unlike anything in his experience. The horror of these dungeons cannot be overstated. People were chained together. They were beaten regularly. They were given minimal food and water. The psychological torment was intense. The uncertainty about what would happen next, the absolute powerlessness, the witnessing of suffering all around them. It was also in these dungeons that Kunta would have encountered the reality of the European system directly. The men who guarded the dungeons were often cruel with a casual indifference. They viewed the captives as less than human. They were working for a commercial operation, and in that commercial operation, each captive was simply an economic unit, a body that needed to survive long enough to be transported and sold. At some point after his arrival at the coast, Kunta Kinte was loaded onto a slave ship. The ship that carried him across the Atlantic is not definitively identified in the historical record, though researchers have attempted to trace it. What we do know is the nature of the voyage itself, because hundreds of enslaved Africans survived the Middle Passage and later documented their experiences, and because the records of slave ship captains, merchants, and insurers provide detailed information about the conditions of these voyages. The ships used in the slave trade were merchant vessels that had been modified to transport enslaved people. They were not large by the standards of later ocean-going vessels, but they were packed with human beings in numbers that defied basic principles of survival. A ship that might have reasonably carried 100 free passengers was loaded with 400 or 500 captives. The enslaved people were stored below decks in the hold of the ship. The hold was divided into compartments, and people were packed into these compartments with virtually no room to move, often unable to sit upright, certainly unable to lie fully prone. The darkness was absolute during the portions of the voyage when the hatches were sealed. The heat was suffocating. The stench from human waste, from vomit, from disease was overwhelming. The food provided was deliberately minimalist, enough to keep people alive theoretically, but often not adequate to maintain health. Water was frequently contaminated. The sanitation situation was catastrophic by any standard. People were forced to defecate and urinate in buckets that were sometimes not emptied for days. The resulting filth was inescapable. The human cost of the Middle Passage, cost of the middle, was staggering. Historians estimate that approximately 15 to 20% of the captives died during the voyage across the Atlantic. This was considered an acceptable loss rate by the merchants involved. In fact, insurance policies existed to compensate merchants for these losses. The death of captives was factored into the business model. Diseases flourished in the holds of slave ships. Dysentery, malaria, smallpox, and other infections ripped through the captive populations. People died from dehydration. People died from infected wounds sustained during capture or during the voyage itself. People died from despair. They gave up, simply ceased to eat, chose death as an alternative to continued suffering. The ship captains documented instances of this, referring to it in clinical terms as voluntary refusal of sustenance. Kunta Kinte survived the Middle Passage. This fact itself is significant. The majority of people who were captured and subjected to this journey did not survive it. Kunta's survival was partly a matter of health, partly a matter of chance, and perhaps partly a matter of will. He emerged from the hold of that ship alive, though changed in ways that could never be fully articulated. The voyage across the Atlantic took approximately 6 to 8 weeks, depending on weather conditions and the specific route taken. For those weeks, Kunta existed in conditions that were deliberately designed to break the human spirit. The darkness, the confinement, the filth, the hunger, the witnessing of death all around him. These were not accidental byproducts of transportation. They were integral to a system designed to terrorize captives into compliance, to erase their sense of self, to prepare them for the status of enslaved people. There are documented accounts of resistance during the Middle Passage. Enslaved people organized rebellions. Some freed themselves from shackles. Some attempted to seize control of ships. Some jumped overboard, choosing death over further captivity. The ship captains and crew lived in constant awareness that the enslaved people below deck might at any moment rise up against them. This fear informed every security measure, every act of cruelty, every decision about how to manage the human cargo. The transatlantic voyage that brought Kunta to the Americas was one of thousands of such voyages. Millions of people made this journey. The scale of the enterprise is almost incomprehensible. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, ships moved back and forth across the Atlantic, carrying enslaved African people to the Americas, carrying goods produced by enslaved labor back to Africa and Europe, and carrying profits to merchants in European cities. It was an industry that operated openly with full government sanction. The governments of England, France, Spain, and other European powers actively encouraged the slave trade. They offered subsidies to merchants engaged in the trade. They provided naval protection for slave ships. They had established legal frameworks that defined enslaved people as property rather than persons. This was not a criminal enterprise operating in darkness. This was state-sponsored commerce, conducted in the full light of day. In 1767, a year after his capture, Kunta Kinte arrived in Virginia. The colony of Virginia was in the midst of dramatic transformation. Tobacco had become the dominant crop, and the demand for labor to cultivate tobacco was enormous. The indigenous population had been decimated through disease and violence over the preceding century and a half. The supply of indentured servants from Europe was insufficient to meet the labor demands of the colonial planters. It was during this period in the mid-18th century that the transatlantic slave trade reached its peak. The number of Africans being forcibly transported to the American colonies was increasing exponentially. Virginia, with its vast plantations and its relentless demand for labor, became one of the primary destinations for enslaved Africans. When Kunta was brought off the ship in Virginia, he was placed in a holding yard, essentially a pen, where he was examined by potential buyers. The examination was degrading and invasive. Buyers would assess his physical condition, check his teeth, evaluate his musculature, look for signs of disease or injury. The process itself was designed to reduce him to a collection of physical attributes, to strip him of humanity, to transform him into an economic unit. Kunta was purchased by a Virginia planter and transported to a plantation. The plantation system was built on violence, on the threat of violence, and on a legal system that defined enslaved people as the property of their owners with virtually no rights of any kind. An enslaved person could not own property, could not marry legally, could not testify in court against a white person, could not move freely, could not gather with other enslaved people without permission. The plantation where Kunta found himself was a large operation, probably producing tobacco or cotton or perhaps both. The work was backbreaking. It was designed to extract maximum labor from the enslaved people while providing them with minimal sustenance. The day began before dawn and extended into darkness. People worked in heat and humidity, in rain, in conditions that would sicken and eventually kill many of them. The housing provided to enslaved people was deliberately inadequate. Typically, a small wooden cabin housed multiple people, sometimes 5, 6, or more individuals who had no family relationship to each other. There was no privacy. There were no facilities for personal cleanliness. The diet was restricted to the minimum necessary for survival: cornmeal, salt pork, occasionally some vegetables from gardens that enslaved people were sometimes allowed to maintain. Kunta would have been assigned work appropriate to his age and strength. He was a young man in the prime of his physical capabilities. He would have been worked hard, pushed to exhaustion, threatened with punishment if his output was deemed insufficient. It was during this period that Kunta began the resistance that would define his life in captivity. He refused to accept the identity that slavery sought to impose on him. He refused to respond to the slave name that he was given. He escaped on multiple occasions, attempting to make his way back to the coast, to find a ship that might return him to Africa. Each escape was captured and returned. Each return was met with brutal punishment. The accounts of Kunta's resistance are documented in the recollections of his descendants and in the oral histories that were preserved through his family. He endured whippings. He suffered injuries. He was separated from any family that he might have formed. And yet he maintained, internally, spiritually, a connection to his identity as a Mandinka man, as a free person who had been stolen, not someone born into slavery. The psychological resilience that this required cannot be overstated. In a system designed to break the human spirit, Kunta maintained his sense of self. He held onto his language. He held onto his cultural practices. He maintained his faith. He refused at the deepest level to accept that he was property. The system of slavery that held Kunta Kinte in bondage was not improvised or chaotic. It was precisely calculated. It was built on elaborate legal frameworks. It was sustained by violence, yes, but also by ideology, a carefully constructed worldview that justified the enslavement of African people and the extraction of their labor. American slavery by the mid-18th century had become fundamentally racialized. This is crucial to understand. Slavery had existed in various forms throughout human history. People of many different races had been enslaved for many different reasons. But the slavery that developed in the American colonies was explicitly and systematically based on race. Africans and their descendants were defined as slaves by virtue of their race. This was not natural. This was not inevitable. This was a deliberate legal and ideological construction. The transformation from a labor system that was fluid and sometimes involved indentured servitude from multiple populations to a system based explicitly on the permanent, hereditary enslavement of people defined as African took place gradually across the 17th century and crystallized in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It was the product of legislation passed by colonial governments, of court decisions, of customs that hardened into law. A series of colonial laws established that enslaved status would be inherited. The children of enslaved mothers would themselves be enslaved. This meant that slavery became self-perpetuating without requiring constant importation from Africa, though the transatlantic slave trade continued and accelerated anyway. It also meant that slavery became permanent in a new way. There was no possibility of earning freedom through service. Slavery was now a lifetime condition, inherited by one's children, and one's children's children into perpetuity. Other laws established that Africans were to be enslaved, while people of European descent could not be. This distinction was written into law. It was enforced through the courts. It meant that slavery was becoming explicitly a racial category. Africans were defined as enslavable by nature, while people of European descent were defined as inherently free. The ideology that supported this system portrayed Africans as naturally suited to slavery. Whites who profited from slavery developed elaborate pseudoscientific theories arguing that Africans were less intelligent than Europeans, that they were more suited to work in hot climates, that they were naturally inclined towards servitude. These theories were completely false, but they served a crucial function. They allowed white people to justify the unjustifiable, to feel that they were not committing a terrible wrong, but simply putting people into roles for which they were naturally suited. Religion was also weaponized to support slavery. Christian ministers argued that enslaved people should accept their condition because they would receive reward in the next life. They interpreted biblical passages as supporting slavery. They portrayed themselves as bringing Christianity and civilization to people they represented as heathens and savages. This religious justification was enormously powerful because it offered white slave owners a way to see themselves as moral people engaged in a moral enterprise. The legal system was structured to prevent enslaved people from defending themselves or seeking justice. An enslaved person could not testify in court. An enslaved person could not own property. An enslaved person could not appeal to the law for protection from violence. The laws of the colonies established that the punishment of enslaved people was entirely at the discretion of their owners. There were occasional laws that prohibited owners from killing enslaved people or subjecting them to extreme torture. But these laws had minimal enforcement and were often ignored. The violence that sustained slavery was constant and systematic. It was not incidental to the system. It was fundamental to it. Whipping was the most common form of punishment, but far from the only one. Enslaved people were burned, mutilated, had fingers and toes severed, were left in iron cages to die slowly. The violence was often inflicted for trivial infractions, for speaking back to an overseer, for working too slowly, for attempting to escape, or sometimes for no provable reason at all. The threat of violence was constant. Every enslaved person lived in awareness that their body could be subjected to extreme pain at any moment. They lived with the awareness that their family members could be sold away from them at any moment. They lived with the awareness that there was no legal recourse, no appeal, no protection. It was into this system that Kunta Kinte was forced. He was not enslaved by a single person in isolation. He was enslaved by a comprehensive system of laws, customs, ideologies, and violence that had been constructed to make slavery permanent, hereditary, and racial. Kunta Kinte's resistance to slavery was not a single dramatic act. It was a sustained, multi-form, decades-long refusal to accept the identity that slavery sought to impose on him. The first form of his resistance was the simplest and most profound. He refused to accept his slave name. When he was assigned a new name by his owner, he did not respond to it. He continued to call himself Kunta Kinte. The names that enslaved people were given were often deliberately dehumanizing. Names that were easy for white overseers to pronounce. Names that were associated with lowness or servitude. Names that erased the African names that the people had been born with. By refusing this name, by insisting on his own identity, Kunta was asserting his right to self-determination in the most fundamental way possible. The second form of his resistance was escape. Kunta attempted multiple times to flee the plantation where he was held. The records suggest that he tried to make his way back to the coast, to find a ship that might take him back to Africa. He was recaptured each time. On one occasion, according to historical accounts, he was beaten so severely by slave catchers, men who were hired to hunt down escaped enslaved people, that he was permanently injured. His foot was broken, leaving him with a limp that would affect him for the rest of his life. This injury did not break his resistance. Even with a damaged foot, Kunta maintained his dignity and his refusal to accept slavery as legitimate. The third form of his resistance was cultural. Kunta maintained his African identity. He preserved the languages he had spoken. He was multilingual in African languages. He maintained his faith, which was Islam. He maintained the customs and practices of his people. He taught these things to others, particularly to his children, seeking to ensure that his cultural identity would be transmitted even within slavery. The fourth form of his resistance was the transmission of memory. Kunta told his story to his family. He told them about his homeland. He told them about his capture. He told them about the journey across the Middle Passage. He insisted that they know where they came from, who they were beyond the identity that slavery imposed on them. This act of transmission was itself an act of tremendous courage and historical significance. In a system that sought to erase history, that sought to make enslaved people forget where they came from, Kunta preserved memory. He maintained the historical consciousness that connected his descendants to their African past. We know about Kunta Kinte's story partly because of the work of Alex Haley, a writer who conducted extensive research in the 20th century, traveling to the Gambia and other West African locations to verify the details of Kunta Kinte's life that had been preserved in oral history within his family. Haley traced the genealogy of his own family, discovering that he was descended from Kunta Kinte. The work that Haley did to uncover and document this history was itself an act of resistance to the erasure of African American history. Kunta Kinte lived until 1783 or 1784, dying in slavery. He never returned to Africa. He never achieved freedom. He never saw his family members born free in the way that he had been born free. And yet he achieved something that slavery could never fully take from him. He maintained his identity. He maintained his dignity. He maintained his humanity in a system designed to deny his humanity. The significance of Kunta Kinte's life extends far beyond his individual story. He represents thousands and ultimately millions of Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas, who were subjected to slavery, and who maintained their humanity and their resistance in the face of systematic dehumanization. But there is something else that Kunta's story reveals that America, for a very long time, did not want revealed. His story demonstrates that slavery was not something that happened to passive victims who accepted their fate. Slavery was something that was imposed on people who resisted, who fought back, who refused to accept it as legitimate. The history of American slavery is not just a history of oppression, it is a history of resistance. By the time Kunta Kinte died in slavery in Virginia, the system that held him had expanded dramatically. The transatlantic slave trade was operating at full industrial capacity. Millions of Africans had been brought to the Americas. The wealth generated by their forced labor was transforming the colonial economy and laying the foundations for what would become the United States. The numbers are staggering. Between 1730 and 1740, approximately 800,000 Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. Between 1740 and 1750, that number was approximately 1 million. By the 1760s, when Kunta was captured, the trade was accelerating further. The decade from 1750 to 1760 saw the forced migration of over 1.2 million people. This was not a trade conducted by a handful of rogue merchants operating outside the law. This was commerce that was central to the colonial economies of North America, the Caribbean, South America, and Brazil. This was commerce that involved the governments of European nations, major merchant houses, insurance companies, and banking institutions. The wealth generated by slavery was extraordinary. A planter who could acquire enslaved labor for a relatively small upfront investment could generate enormous wealth through the extracted labor of those enslaved people. The labor of these enslaved people worked to exhaustion and producing at a rate that could never be achieved through the employment of free workers, generated the capital that was invested in other enterprises. Some historians have argued that the capital generated by slavery and the slave trade provided the foundational investment that fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The wealth flowing from Africa and the Americas to European ports provided the surplus capital that funded the development of industrial technology. This argument is still debated among historians, but it points to something undeniable. Slavery and the slave trade were not peripheral to the development of the modern world economy. They were central to it. In North America specifically, slavery became the foundation of the economy in the southern colonies, and later the southern states. The labor of millions of enslaved people worked at maximum intensity for maximum duration with minimal compensation generated the wealth of the planter class. This wealth allowed the development of cities, the establishment of commerce and trade networks, the accumulation of capital. But slavery was not simply an economic system. It was a social system. It shaped every aspect of colonial and later American society. The planter class became the dominant political force in the southern colonies and later the southern states. They shaped the laws. They controlled the legislatures. They determined policy. The interest of slaveholders became the central interest of government. This political dominance extended beyond the South. Northern merchants, northern shipbuilders, northern traders all profited from slavery. Northern merchants provided goods that were traded for enslaved people on the African coast. Northern ships transported enslaved people across the Atlantic. Northern traders provided the goods that enslaved people were forced to consume. Northern insurance companies insured slave ships and provided coverage for losses when enslaved people died in transit. The textile mills of the North depended on cotton produced by enslaved labor in the South. The banks of the North provided loans to Southern planters. The economy of the North was deeply intertwined with the economy of slavery. This was not a system that was confined to the Southern states. This was a national system that generated wealth that flowed in all directions. The political arrangements that protected slavery were national in scope. The Constitution of the United States, drafted in 1787, explicitly protected slavery. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved people as three-fifths of a person for purposes of representation in Congress and the Electoral College, giving Southern states increased political power without giving enslaved people any rights. The Fugitive Slave Clause allowed Southern slaveholders to pursue enslaved people who had escaped to Northern states and demand their return. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 made it a federal crime to help an enslaved person escape. Northern states that had gradually eliminated slavery were required to participate in the recapture and return of enslaved people who had fled to their territories. The federal government was enlisted in the protection and expansion of slavery. By the early 19th century, slavery had become more deeply entrenched in American law and American society than ever before. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made the cultivation of cotton vastly more profitable. The demand for enslaved labor exploded. The international slave trade was made illegal by the federal government in 1808, but the domestic slave trade, the buying and selling of people already held in slavery within the United States, continued and accelerated. Kunta Kinte had died at the height of this expansion, witnessing but not living through the full development of this system. He had seen the early stages. His descendants, his great-great-grandchildren, would live through the full development and ultimate collapse of American slavery. One of the most important historical resources for understanding American slavery is the testimony of people who lived through it. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Works Progress Administration funded a project to record the memories of formerly enslaved people. People who had lived through slavery and had survived to old age in the early 20th century. These recordings and transcripts constitute an invaluable archive. We have the actual voices of people who experienced slavery, describing what happened to them, what they witnessed, how they understood their own experiences. These are not accounts filtered through the interpretations of white historians or white observers. These are direct testimonies. The accounts are consistent, over and over across different regions, different plantations, different time periods. The same themes emerge. The work was exhausting, the hunger was constant, the violence was ever present. The separation of family members was devastating and traumatic. The power of the slaveholder was absolute and arbitrary. And yet, over and over, people also described resistance. The small rebellions, the maintenance of dignity, the preservation of culture, the transmission of knowledge. Many of the accounts describe the strategies that enslaved people employed to survive and to resist. Some described working more slowly than they were capable of, claiming that they were not strong enough to work faster, protecting themselves from being worked to death. Some described stealing food or other goods, asserting a claim to resources in defiance of the slaveholders' exclusive ownership. Some described using knowledge of plants and herbs to treat themselves and others, a form of medicine that connected them to African traditions. Others described the songs that enslaved people sang while working. These songs had multiple functions. They coordinated the rhythm of work. Different tasks required different tempos, and the songs helped enslaved people work together in unison. But they also contained meanings that were hidden from the slaveholder but understood by other enslaved people. The songs communicated information about routes to freedom. They encoded messages about resistance. They maintained cultural memory. The testimonies also describe the internal social structures that existed within slavery. Enslaved people formed communities. They established relationships based on kinship, both biological and adopted. They created family structures that slavery could not legally recognize, but that were nonetheless real. They supported each other through the horrors that they endured. They celebrated births. They mourned deaths. They maintained dignity in impossible circumstances. Many of the accounts describe religion. Christianity had been imposed on enslaved people by their enslavers, who justified slavery through religious arguments. But enslaved people transformed Christianity, creating their own religious traditions that emphasized God's justice, the eventual liberation of the oppressed, the value of every soul in the eyes of God. The Christianity of enslaved people was radically different from the Christianity of slaveholders, even though they were ostensibly the same religion. The testimonies also describe education. Enslaved people were often forbidden from learning to read. Teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in many southern states. Yet some enslaved people learned to read anyway. Some were taught by enslaved people who had already acquired literacy. Some taught themselves. The acquisition of literacy was an act of defiance, an assertion of the right to knowledge that slavery tried to deny. The formerly enslaved people who were interviewed in the 1930s spoke with the perspectives of people who had lived through slavery and who had survived to see it end. Some had been freed by the Civil War. Some had been freed by individual slaveholders. All of them had experienced slavery as something that could and should have been prevented, as something that was fundamentally wrong. Yet many also expressed an awareness of the resilience they had developed, the strength they had demonstrated, the ways in which they had maintained their humanity. These testimonies are important because they center the voices of people who experienced slavery directly. For too long, the history of slavery was written by people who were not enslaved, who did not experience it firsthand. The accounts of slaveholders and white observers dominated the historical record. The voices of enslaved people themselves were marginalized or absent. When we listen to these testimonies, we hear history from the perspective of those who lived it. We hear complexity, we hear resistance alongside accommodation. We hear cultural creativity alongside trauma. We hear the fundamental humanity of people